right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to part one of our Coping with COVID-19 webinar series. Today's discussion is around how parents can best support their children during these difficult times and strategies for making decisions as the state slowly begins to reopen. I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Jill Goldberg Arnold. Jill is a clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience specializing in work with children and adolescents. She received her PhD from SUNY Binghamton and is currently in private practice in Norwood. You may remember Jill as being our Temple president from 2017 to 2019. She's also joining us again as our incoming president next week. Jill is also a mother of a teenager and a young adult. Thanks for being here, Jill.
I'm happy to be here.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amy Ginden. I am a board member at Temple Sinai, and I am a mom of an almost 3-year-old, so I certainly have a vested interest in this topic tonight. A quick disclaimer before we dive into our discussion. The information that we're about to share is strictly for educational purposes and is not in any way intended as psychological counseling or psychological consultation. Due to the sensitivity of this topic, we're keeping all of our participants anonymous and muted, but we encourage you to ask questions by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Whatever you type will be sent only to myself and Jill. So let's get started.
All right.
First question for you, Jill. Parents with young kids are presented with a unique set of challenges during this pandemic. They're both trying to work and occupy their children simultaneously, with many of the normal child-related resources and activities unavailable to them. What have you been telling parents at your practice who are stretched thin and trying to do it all?
I think the first thing parents need to recognize is that you can't do it all, and it's okay to not do it all. And even though I've spent the vast majority of my career saying keep screen time to a minimum, I think we've all kind of had to recognize that an extra movie here and there and some extra screen time is not going to be the end of the world. It's not going to be forever. And it's really okay. It's also okay to say you need to play by yourself for a while, and to take some time for yourself, because you really can't be available 24/7. And so it's about trying to strike a balance of giving good attention when you are able to, and letting kids know, I can't pay attention right now.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I think people are definitely finding some kind of loose schedule, and kids do better with predictability. So letting them know, I've got a conference call, I can't talk for the next 45 minutes, but at this time, then we can spend some time playing. And that's really helpful to kids, is having those expectations set.
We've definitely been giving our child extra screen time, so it makes a lot of sense.
You know, it's not forever. We will eventually get to detox them and get them back to a more normal level of screen time, and the nicer weather hopefully will give some opportunities to do that as well.
Absolutely. So, as facts about the coronavirus seem to evolve every week, how can parents determine what's developmentally appropriate to share with their children about the current state of our pandemic without risking unnecessary emotional stress on their children?
There's a rule we have always used for difficult topics with kids, and that is answer their questions and only their questions. So kids are pretty good about asking what they can handle hearing. And if you answer it in a basic way that's at their level, if they need more information, they'll ask the next question, and then you ask that question. And we've been dealing with these questions around how baby brothers and sisters get there, how dealing with death and dying. We've been answering these kinds of questions for kids for a long time, and they're pretty good at asking what they need to know. In some cases, we're having to prepare kids for things like, you know, seeing people with masks on is certainly a new experience for most kids. And so preparing kids in advance that mommy or daddy is going to be wearing a mask, and giving them opportunities to try masks on themselves. I've seen lots of masks on stuffed animals and dolls as kids sort of figure out that our new normal is with masks. Um, and they'll engage and ask, or they'll just accept and move on. And I think we're finding a lot of kids just accepting and moving on.
Yeah.
They don't need to know a lot of stuff that's going on. They only need to know the things that directly impact them. And I think we're all used to doing a lot of prepping our kids in advance and telling them what's coming and helping set expectations. And we're having to change our ways with that a little bit. I think that it's not helpful to the kids to give them a range of this might happen and that might happen. And so we're needing to wait a little bit longer and then tell them what to expect when we actually know. It helps them to not have a lot of what ifs going on in their heads.
Mm-hmm. I know for us, we let our son pick out his mask just as a way of giving a small sense of control over a period that feels like there's so little of it.
Picking masks, then making a mask for a doll. I've seen lots of kids. I mean, the same things we sort of have to use the principles we know. What have we always done when kids have to have some sort of medical procedure? We let them play with the mask. We let them, take stuffed animals and pretend the stuffed animal is having that experience. We let them explore it through play, especially for little kids, and slightly older kids can talk it through.
Mm-hmm.
So I think using the principles we know and just answering not what our anxiety makes us want to explore, but what they are looking to know.
Absolutely. Talk to me about changes in mood and behaviors. I think as parents, we've all seen our children have shifts in mood and different behaviors over the last few months. What are some of the common things that you've seen in kids at your practice as it relates to the pandemic?
So I think there are a couple of different categories. One is when kids experience a lot of change, they tend to get more anxious. So I think we're seeing a lot more clingy behavior, a lot less independence. And it makes some sense, right? We from an early age, we send kids to daycare, we send them to kindergarten, they get used to going away from us, they go to camp, they go to all these different places. And then we said, no, everybody needs to stay home, right? You have to stay home where mom and dad are also staying home. And so kind of naturally that makes kids think, if I need to stay home, then I must need mom and dad more. And so you get a little more clinginess, a little more anxiety. They're also they don't have a lot of their normal outlets. So kids' outlets are through play. It's often through their outlets or often through their peers. And so I think we're seeing some grumpiness, some irritability, which can turn into anger and outbursts. I'm doing a lot of talking with people about recognizing that sources of joy are somewhat limited. A play date can be this euphoric experience for kids. They're super excited, their friends coming over, and we haven't been able to do very much of that. We're able now to do a little more outdoor stuff, but they're still limited, and they know, and even when they are together, they know they're supposed to keep physical distance, and they can only be, some families have found pods to be with, but they can only be with certain people. And so they're struggling with anxiety, they're struggling with some irritability, in some cases some just sadness, because maybe they're not getting to see a grandparent that they're used to spending a lot of time with. Their worlds have shrunk.
Mm-hmm.
And often with it, some of the things they really like to do, their sports seasons, they've all taken a lot of losses. And so we have to sort of recognize and be empathetic that they are sad to some degree. And as much as we might be able to see in some cases some silver linings, they don't really see it that way. Certainly not yet. so it's really sadness, irritability, and anxiety. And some of it I'd say is pretty normal, because I think the adults are experiencing a lot of that as well. And then we need to recognize that our moods have some impact. Kids feel it. And so when we're anxious, kids tend to feel it. When we're irritable and snappy and overwhelmed, they feel it. So the more parents can find a way to do some self-care, and as much as they might feel some guilt that they're taking that time is actually really important. You're more able to be available and to be able to hold your kids' feelings. Kids look to us as their parents to be the container for how they feel. And if we're in good shape, we're much more able to contain how our kids are feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think that, like you said, we're all feeling this, and kids read what we're feeling all of the time, and that feeds into their own anxieties. So that makes a lot of sense. And I think as parents, sometimes we struggle with how authentic should we be with our feelings around small children versus being strong and being brave for them. And so there's definitely that balance.
That's an interesting question, because when you're dealing with something that's definable, like a loss, there's some value in being authentic. Kids are very authentic with their feelings. And so when our feelings are kind of matching theirs, and we're sharing our feelings as a way of providing support, that's one thing. But we also have to make sure that we're not asking our kids to contain our feelings for us.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the things we're feeling, if we're absorbing the news and feeling overwhelmed, that's probably not a set of emotions that we're going to be authentic and share with our kids.
Right.
But if we're, sad that soccer season just got canceled, and our kids also sad that soccer season is canceled, it's a good opportunity to share. Yeah, I'm really sad too. I really enjoy watching you play.
Right.
And I'm very sad. I'm not going to have the joy of watching you play, and I'm sad that you're sad, right? And so there are things that we can share and be very authentic, and then there are things that they really don't need to know.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in the last several weeks, there's been so much going on in the media, so much that the kids are actually thinking and talking about. Kids are very aware of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they're wanting to talk about it, and they're wanting to understand it. They're feeling overwhelmed and needing to process. So there is a lot to process with kids, and there are good conversations to have with them. But we have to make sure that we're not giving them our stuff to hold.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we're talking about the short-term effects. What are kids experiencing right now during this pandemic? But let's talk a little bit about the long-term effects. I know someone in the chat asked about trauma-related symptoms after we go through this pandemic, but even the effects of kids not being able to play with their peers, or the losses they might be experiencing academically, or falling behind in school because they're not in an optimal situation. What are you telling parents right now who are concerned about this potentially long-term damage that the pandemic could be doing on our children?
Let's take it developmentally, right? So if we start with very young kids, there are some things with young kids that have a developmental window, right? Like language and exposure to language, exposure to facial expressions and those kinds of things. Young kids have sort of traded off right now exposure to peers for more time with mom and dad. So those kids they're gonna get what they need in terms of language exposure. They're gonna get what they need in terms of face-to-face interaction, because mom and dad are stuck at home with them. And they're getting lots of interaction with parents. Enjoying being with peers is such an innate experience for kids. We don't have to show them, like, when they can be back with peers again, we're not going to have to teach them that that's enjoyable, right? They just love to be around their friends. They may need some help relearning turn taking, but they need that on a daily basis anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no developmental window on learning turn taking, right? You can learn that along the way. So I think, and kids are quite resilient. they're just learning different things. And when we watch development happen, it doesn't go evenly, right? They don't develop evenly across each developmental area. They kind of focus in on one thing and then they focus in on another. And so we often see like a kid who really races ahead with their motor skills, but doesn't talk for a while, or a kid who's very, very verbal and very focused on their verbal skills, but isn't really interested in their fine motor and motor skills, but they get there. So I think probably what's happening with little kids is they're focusing on different things. And as long as home is a safe, joyful place, and we're finding ways to be joyful in simple little ways, they're going to be fine. And they're going to play catch up on things, keeping in mind that everybody's in the same boat, right? So they haven't fallen behind anyone. We've just changed the path some. And we don't know where that path is going to take us. But as long as we are continuing to support kids and give them room to explore and play, they're going to explore and play, and they're going to learn whether we tell them what to learn or not. You can also keep in mind that these days we teach pre-literacy skills in preschool. We didn't always do that. Like, I always go back to my father tells a story, and he's a boomer. He tells a story that he wasn't handed a pen to write with until second grade. He's been an English major in college, right? And taught me to write, and is a very skillful writer.
He
So
figured it out.
it reminds me, like, you don't have to hold a pen or a pencil and learn your letters when you're 4. You can actually learn them later, and it's okay. And as far as academic skills go, everybody didn't learn as optimally across the globe as they could have.
Right.
So I think every teacher out there knows that if the kid is coming to them in 3rd grade, they need to review a little bit the last third of 2nd grade, and maybe even start somewhere in the 2nd grade curriculum before they really launch into the 3rd grade curriculum. So maybe they're behind, but it's okay, because everybody's behind. It's not your child versus another. You know, we kept everybody moving with virtual learning. Some people benefited more than others. For some people, it really was not a good educational environment. You know, some kids really didn't learn well that way. Other kids did very well with it, but it's okay. They will catch up. You know, by the time they're applying to college, all will be okay. They will have caught up on the math they needed to catch up on. Their reading skills will be right there. They'll be writing. As far as social emotional, if, you know, we're not going to know for a while, right? But I wonder, there's some things I wonder about. One thing I wonder about is whether kids are going to learn some patience, some tolerance for uncertainty, and some gratitude. So there may be some things that kids learn from a social emotional perspective that are actually helpful. Kids are used to us paving the way for them, telling them everything to expect, taking all uncertainty away as much as possible. And we can't. And they're learning, if we're supporting them well in that, they're learning to tolerate. We need to just stay on today and find simple things to enjoy today. And that may not be a bad message for kids. There may be some real positives in that. In terms of managing trauma, it all depends on what kids are actually experiencing in their day-to-day environment. A lot of what they're experiencing is boredom. I think it probably depends on how much loss kids are experiencing, and that's going to vary from community to community. Some communities have been very hard hit. Others have been more modestly hit. You know, certainly working with kids through grief and loss will be important in some situations. But kids are actually pretty good at doing grief and loss because they're pretty honest with their feelings. And so one of the ways we can reduce the risk of trauma is not sharing, you know, not putting our emotions on kids, but B, making space for their emotions and acknowledging that they might be scared or disappointed or frustrated or not being able to do all of the things they enjoy.
Yeah. I think the idea you brought up about actually the silver lining of having gratitude and enjoying the present is such an important lesson that so many of us as adults never had to learn. And so
Yeah.
we're all kind of in this boat together.
This is the time to learn mindfulness,
Yeah.
right? And there are actually some good apps. I happen to really like the Headspace bundles for kids that are set up age. You can look at the bundles for different age groups, um, but it's a good time to practice mindfulness. But boy, when they can play with their friends again without having to really think about it, I think all of these kids are going to really be grateful that they can do that.
For sure. Um, well, let's talk about making choices around risk. As the state slowly begins to reopen, families are making choices around what they're comfortable letting their kids do and not do. And obviously, these choices are very individual to each family's particular situation and their comfort level. You shared a visual with me, so I'll share that with the group. But as I share this, can you talk to me about how parents can determine what these rules are when so much is unknown and so much is shifting on a week to week basis?
Absolutely. I think we all have to sort of keep in mind that the state's guidelines are based on managing healthcare capacity and managing the economy, right? And keeping the metrics low in general. That doesn't give very good individual family to family guidance. And we know that we have certain guidelines, like, we should all be keeping, I personally don't like the term social distancing. I much prefer the term physical distancing. Let's stay socially close and emotionally close to each other, but keep the physical distance we need to maintain safety. So the common sense things like keeping distance, using masks when we're not able to keep distance, those, washing hands, cleaning surfaces, those guidelines certainly always make sense. But we also somewhere have to start balancing emotional and mental health with managing risk. And so I have found this graphic helpful because it helps us think about the lowest risk for us is staying at home just with the people we live with. We've done that for a while. It has its own risks, right? That we're not in contact with people, and it gets really hard. We also all have to know what our family risk is and recognize that some people are certainly at greater risk from this virus than others. And so every family has to know their own family risk. And then from there, we have to figure out where our risk tolerance is. If staying at home is the lowest risk, moderate risk is doing outdoor activities just as a family group and not touching our faces, wearing masks, staying 6 feet apart from people you don't live with. That's the next level. And then from there, doing smaller gatherings outdoors, again, keeping physical distance, where necessary, wearing a mask. And then from the highest risk activities are indoors with large groups of people. So in balancing emotional and mental health, kids are needing some opportunities to see people. And so doing small outdoor gatherings, finding people who are not taking risks and are largely isolating, and finding people are talking about finding pods or their what do they call it, their COVID bubble, right? Finding people who they can be in a bubble with, that because parents are working at home and not having exposures, and the kids aren't particularly having exposures, that they're able to spend some time together. And so it's every family kind of has to talk through both what their actual risk, whether they have any elevated risks, what they're comfortable with doing. Do they have families that they can create a bit of a bubble with? And then also there's this whole other dimension of there's a lot of judgment going around. And that judgment can be really hard for people. there's, people are very judgmental if you've got a mask on, if you don't have a mask on, how many people are you having over? So there's also a lot of fear for people. If I do this, am I going to be judged for doing it? And so it takes a good amount of sitting back and kind of the adults talking through what's reasonable for us. What could we do that is reasonably safe but takes care of our social emotional lives as well.
Right. And I think that the social and emotional piece plays a bigger factor the longer we go through this, because your tolerance for isolation just goes way down. I think for me, the hardest part is that this is a constant reassessment based on where we are today, where we were in April, where we might be in September. And there's a lot of factors. And I think the choices that we make today might be very different from the choices we make in a month from now. And so keeping that flexibility open, I think has been important for us personally.
I'm finding that, as we tend to be people, like as adults, we tend to look out for a season. We tend to plan like 3-4 months in advance. And we're kind of needing to look at 2-week chunks. Like what's reasonable right now? What's the transmission rate in our community right now? And what feels reasonable? Right now, we can be outdoors. We have some options right now that 4 months from now probably aren't going to make sense anymore. And so I'm encouraging people to sort of look at the summer and think about what can I do in the summer that I'm not going to be able to do when, we live in Massachusetts. It doesn't stay nice and warm that long. And so we have to be somewhat realistic about, using this time to be outdoors. I know a lot of people have found a love of hiking and a love of sunsets who never had that love before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Great. So I only have one more question for you. So if anyone wants to pose questions in the chat, now would be the time if you're holding back. So the last question for you is around school. The governor, if anyone missed it, the governor shared some vague ideas around what school could look like in the fall, with more information promised to come in July. But for school age kids who might be worried about what their lives are going to look like come September, how can parents talk to their kids about what school is going to look like in the fall when we don't really have many answers right now?
I read the 28-page document today just so that I would have a good sense of not just what the pieces the governor highlighted, but the research backing it up and the kind of as many details are available. What I'm sort of encouraging in my practice is talk about what you know and be honest about what you don't know. And so some of that is preparing kids that school is going to, in some ways, feel different. We probably are wearing masks. They're going to give you plenty of mask breaks. They know, we all know you need a break from your mask, and you'll probably take walks outside and get breaks. For elementary school kids, there's probably fewer differences than for middle school and high school kids. Middle school kids are probably not going to have, well, they're definitely not going to have group lunches. So there's going to be much more classroom specific, like lunches in classrooms rather than using cafeterias. So my suggestion to people is talk about what you know. Talk about what fabrics you want your masks, what masks do you want? Because we probably are all going to need, the same number of masks as we have underwear, because I don't know about you, but I don't want to be washing masks every single night of the week.
Right.
What fabrics do you want? What do you want? What prints do you want on your mask? Let's make them cool. And other than that, saying, and we're gonna wait as we have more information. We'll talk about it together. We'll know in advance. Nothing's going to happen, the day before. But it's not helpful. The current guidelines have a lot of different scenarios in them. Everything from almost everyone back at school to some kind of hybrid to all virtual. And schools are being told that or districts are being told that they need to have plans for all three scenarios. That's way too much information for kids. They don't need to be spinning, what's hybrid going to look like, and what if we're back at home. So the answer is really, when you're in the building, we know you'll be wearing a mask. Other than that, we don't know that much yet. We know that the district is working on it and now has enough guidance from the governor to really work on it.
Yeah, that's
And
helpful.
it's hard to deal with that kind of uncertainty. Kids want to know, we all want to know,
Right.
but in general, spinning a lot of what ifs and kind of going over what it could look like and trying to prepare them for all options, that tends to create more anxiety than relief. Whereas once we know what the plan is, then we can walk kids through, this is the plan, and let's get used to it. So my guidance would be to tell kids, when we know, we'll have plenty of time and we will prepare you for everything that's coming.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Well, that's all we have prepared for today. Thank you, Jill, so much for taking the time to be here, and for all of you for attending. I encourage you to check back on our Temple website next week for a recording of this webinar, which you can send to anyone who you think might benefit from this discussion, but who couldn't make it tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for hosting.